The rancher's wife had been dead for 3 years when Margaret Grace stumbled into his life carrying nothing but a worn carpetbag and the weight of feeling invisible to the entire world. Margaret had traveled from Kansas City to the Oklahoma Territory in the autumn of 1891, fleeing a life where she had been the youngest of 7 daughters, perpetually overlooked and undervalued. Her parents had barely noticed when she left, too consumed with marrying off her prettier sisters to men of means. At 23 years old, Margaret had saved every spare penny from working as a seamstress, determined to answer an advertisement for a schoolteacher in Kingfisher, a growing town that promised opportunity for those brave enough to seek it. The stagecoach had broken an axle 15 miles outside of town, stranding her and 3 other passengers under the blazing Oklahoma sun. The driver assured them help would arrive by nightfall, but Margaret knew better than to trust such promises. She had learned early in life that if she wanted something done, she would have to do it herself, even if nobody noticed her efforts. She started walking, ignoring the protests from the other passengers. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, golden grass rippling in the hot wind. Her boots, already worn thin, began to blister her feet within the first mile. Still, Margaret pressed forward, her jaw set with determination. She would reach Kingfisher. She would start her new position as schoolteacher. She would finally matter to someone somewhere. 3 miles down the dusty road, her vision began to swim. The heat was oppressive, and she had foolishly rationed her water too carefully. Margaret stumbled, catching herself with her free hand, dirt grinding into her palm. She pushed herself upright and continued walking, one foot in front of the other, refusing to surrender to the vast indifference of the prairie. That was when she saw the rider approaching from the west, moving at a steady pace. Margaret stopped, shading her eyes against the sun. The figure resolved into a man on a sturdy roan horse, tall in the saddle with broad shoulders and a worn hat pulled low against the glare. He slowed as he approached, and Margaret straightened her spine, determined not to appear as desperate as she felt. Bradford Davis pulled his horse to a stop 10 feet from the woman standing in the middle of the road. He took in her appearance quickly. Dusty traveling dress, carpetbag clutched in white-knuckled hands, face flushed from heat and exertion. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, and her gray eyes held a mixture of wariness and stubborn pride that reminded him painfully of his late wife. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "you look like you could use some help." "The stagecoach broke down," Margaret said, her voice hoarse from thirst. "I am walking to Kingfisher." Bradford glanced down the road behind her, seeing nothing but empty prairie. "That is about 12 miles from here. You will not make it before dark, and you certainly will not make it without more water." He pulled his canteen from where it hung on his saddle and held it out to her. "Drink." Margaret hesitated, pride warring with practical necessity. Practical necessity won. She took the canteen and drank deeply, the water cool and life-giving. When she lowered it, some of the fog had cleared from her mind. "Thank you," she said, handing it back. "I should keep moving." "I have a ranch about 2 miles north," Bradford said. "You can rest there, get a proper meal, and I will take you into Kingfisher in the morning with my supply wagon. It is not safe for a woman to be out here alone after dark." "I appreciate your concern, but I can manage," Margaret said, even as her legs trembled beneath her skirt. Bradford studied her for a long moment. She was afraid of him, or at least afraid of trusting a stranger, and he could not blame her for that. But he also could not, in good conscience, leave her to collapse on the road or worse. "Madam, I am not in the habit of leaving people to die of exposure on my land," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "My name is Bradford Davis. I run the Double D Ranch with my foreman and 6 ranch hands. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, will see to your comfort, and you will have a room with a lock on the door. Come morning, I will deliver you safely to Kingfisher, but I will not ride away and leave you here." Margaret searched his face, looking for signs of deception or ill intent. She found only weathered honesty and a bone-deep weariness that spoke of old grief. He was perhaps 30 years old, with sun-darkened skin and the calloused hands of a man who worked his own land. His brown eyes were kind, and that kindness made something crack in the walls she had built around herself. "I am Margaret Grace," she said quietly. "I am the new schoolteacher in Kingfisher, or at least I am supposed to be." "Then you definitely need to arrive in one piece," Bradford said. He dismounted and gestured to his horse. "She is calm and steady. Do you ride?" "Not well," Margaret admitted. "That is all right. I will walk alongside." He helped her into the saddle, his hands respectful and brief on her waist. Margaret settled herself as best she could, the carpet bag awkward in her lap. Bradford took the reins and began leading the horse north. And despite everything, Margaret felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. The sense that someone had noticed she needed help and chosen to provide it without being asked. The Double D Ranch appeared over a rise in the land, a collection of sturdy buildings arranged around a large main house. It was not grand, but it was well maintained and clearly prosperous. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, and Margaret could see men working near the barns. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, promising warmth and food. Bradford helped her down from the horse, and a small, stern-faced Chinese woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She took one look at Margaret and began speaking rapidly in a mixture of English and Cantonese, gesturing for her to come inside. "Mrs. Chen says you look half dead and need a bath and a hot meal," Bradford translated, though Margaret had understood the gist well enough. "She will take good care of you." "Thank you," Margaret said, meaning it with her whole heart. "You may have saved my life." Bradford shook his head. "You saved your own life by having the sense to walk toward help instead of waiting for it to find you. I just provided the last few miles." He handed her carpet bag to Mrs. Chen. "Rest well, Miss Grace. We will leave for town at first light." Margaret followed Mrs. Chen into the house, glancing back once to see Bradford leading his horse toward the barn, his movements efficient and familiar. She wondered about the sadness she had glimpsed in his eyes, the shadow of loss that lingered around him like the fading light of dusk. Mrs. Chen led her to a small but comfortable room upstairs, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the prairie. True to Bradford's word, there was a lock on the door. The older woman brought hot water for washing and laid out a clean nightgown that must have belonged to someone else once, someone who was gone now. Margaret did not ask. After she had washed away the dust of the road and changed into the borrowed nightgown, Mrs. Chen brought a tray of food. Beef stew thick with vegetables, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and coffee strong enough to stand up and walk. Margaret ate ravenously, realizing she had not had a proper meal since leaving Kansas City 2 days before. When she was finished, Mrs. Chen collected the tray and fixed Margaret with a stern look. "You rest now," she said in heavily accented English. "Master Bradford, he is good man. He will get you to town safe." "I can see that he is a good man," Margaret said. "Has he run this ranch long?" A shadow passed over Mrs. Chen's face. 3 years alone. Before that with wife. Miss Caroline, she was kind lady, got sick, nothing doctor could do. Master Bradford, he works hard now, always working. Not good for man to work so much, not good to be so alone. Margaret felt a pang of sympathy for the rancher who had rescued her. She knew something about loneliness, about the way it could hollow out a person from the inside. "I am sorry for his loss," she said quietly. Mrs. Chen nodded. "You sleep now. Morning comes early on ranch." Alone in the room with the door securely locked, Margaret lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She thought about her life in Kansas City, where she had been all but invisible in her own family. Her mother had never remembered her birthday without prompting. Her father had called her by her sister's names more often than her own. She had learned to make herself small, to ask for nothing, to expect nothing. The schoolteacher position in Kingfisher had seemed like salvation, a chance to start fresh where nobody knew her as the forgettable Grace daughter. But even now, traveling to her new life, she could not shake the feeling that she was insignificant, that her presence or absence made no real difference to anyone. She thought of Bradford Davis, who had stopped to help a stranger without hesitation, who had insisted on her safety even when she was prepared to martyr herself to stubborn pride. It had been a long time since anyone had noticed her, truly seen her as a person who mattered. The experience was disorienting and strangely painful, like blood returning to a numbed limb. Margaret fell asleep with the prairie wind singing through the window, carrying the scent of grass and cattle and endless sky. She woke before dawn to the sound of activity below, boots on wooden floors, the clatter of dishes, low voices in conversation. Margaret dressed quickly in her traveling clothes, which Mrs. Chen had somehow cleaned and pressed while she slept. Her carpetbag sat by the door, also tidied. Margaret felt a rush of gratitude for the housekeeper's kindness. Downstairs, she found Bradford and two of his ranch hands finishing breakfast. Bradford stood when she entered, gesturing to an empty chair. "Miss Grace, please, eat something before we leave. It is a 2-hour drive to Kingfisher." Margaret sat, acutely aware of the men's eyes on her, though not in an uncomfortable way. They were simply curious, and she could not blame them. A strange woman appearing at the ranch must be unusual. Mrs. Chen brought her a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits with gravy. Margaret ate while Bradford discussed the day's work with his men. She watched him as he talked, noticing the way he listened carefully to each man's concerns, the way he made decisions quickly but not rashly. He was a natural leader, confident without being arrogant. When breakfast was finished, Bradford led her outside to where a wagon stood ready, hitched to a pair of sturdy horses. He helped her onto the bench seat, his hand steadying her elbow, and then climbed up beside her. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with streaks of pink and gold. They rode in companionable silence for the first mile, the wagon rattling over the rough road. Margaret watched the prairie wake up around them, birds taking flight, rabbits darting through the grass, the cattle beginning their slow morning movements. "Have you been teaching long?" Bradford asked, breaking the silence. "This will be my first position," Margaret admitted. "I apprenticed with a teacher in Kansas City for 2 years, but she passed away last spring. Her daughter took over the school and had no need of an assistant. What made you choose Kingfisher?" Margaret considered how much to tell him. "I wanted a fresh start," she said finally. "Somewhere nobody knew me." Bradford nodded slowly, as if he understood more than she had said. "The territory is good for that. People here are more interested in what you can do than where you came from." "Is that why you came here?" "I was born in Texas," Bradford said. "Came to the Oklahoma Territory 10 years ago with my wife. We wanted to build something of our own without her father's money or my family's expectations." His voice softened on the word wife, and Margaret remembered what Mrs. Chen had told her. "Mrs. Chen mentioned you lost your wife," Margaret said gently. "I am sorry." Bradford's jaw tightened briefly, then relaxed. "Caroline got pneumonia 3 winters back, By the time we got her to a doctor in Oklahoma City, it was too late. She died in the spring when the wildflowers were blooming. She loved wildflowers. That must have been very difficult, Margaret said, feeling the inadequacy of the words even as she spoke them. It was like losing half of myself, Bradford said quietly. We had been together since we were 18 years old. She was my best friend, my partner in everything. Without her, the ranch felt empty, pointless. I almost sold it that first year. What changed your mind, Mrs. Chen? Bradford said, a small smile touching his lips. She was our housekeeper even when Caroline was alive. One morning, about 6 months after the funeral, I told her I was thinking of selling. She looked me right in the eye and said, "You sell ranch. You dishonor Miss Caroline memory. She build this with you. You keep building, you honor her." That was the end of that discussion. Margaret smiled despite herself. She seems like a formidable woman, she is, and she is right more often than I care to admit. Bradford glanced at her, his brown eyes thoughtful. What about you? You said you wanted to leave Kansas City. Was your family not supportive of your teaching? Margaret looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. My family barely noticed I left, she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. I am the youngest of 7 daughters. By the time I came along, my parents were tired of raising children. My sisters were all prettier, more accomplished, more memorable. I was just there, taking up space, consuming resources, but never quite important enough to matter. She felt Bradford's eyes on her and rushed to continue, embarrassed by her confession. I do not mean to complain. I had food and shelter and education. Many people have far less. But when the opportunity came to start over somewhere else, somewhere I might actually be seen as an individual rather than the forgettable 7th daughter, I took it. That explains the walking 12 miles in the heat, Bradford said. You are used to doing things yourself because nobody else was paying attention. Margaret looked up at him, startled by his perceptiveness. Yes, she whispered. Exactly. Bradford was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses around a rough patch in the road. When he spoke again, his voice was firm with conviction. For what it is worth, Miss Grace, I noticed you yesterday. I noticed your determination and your courage. It takes strength to leave everything you know and strike out on your own. That is not insignificant. That is remarkable. Something inside Margaret's chest began to ache, a sweet pain like thawing after a long freeze. She had spent her entire life believing she was forgettable, dismissible, too ordinary to warrant notice. But this rancher, this widower who carried his own grief like a yoke across his shoulders, had seen her. Really seen her. Thank you, she managed, her voice barely audible over the rattle of the wagon wheels. That means more than you know. They rode in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence, weighted with understanding. Margaret found herself acutely aware of Bradford beside her, the solid warmth of him, the steady competence in the way he handled the horses. She wondered what his life had been like before grief had carved those lines around his eyes, what kind of man he was when he was not carrying the weight of loss. Kingfisher emerged from the prairie like a promise, a collection of wooden buildings arranged along a main street that ran parallel to the railroad tracks. It was larger than Margaret had expected, clearly thriving from the recent land run that had opened the territory to settlement. She could see a general store, a bank, a hotel, a church with a white steeple, and numerous other establishments that spoke of a community establishing itself. Bradford drove the wagon to a neat white building near the church. A sign out front read, Kingfisher School. A middle-aged man was sweeping the front steps, and he looked up as the wagon approached, his face breaking into a smile. Bradford Davis, as I live and breathe, the man called out. What brings you to town on a weekday, Morning Thomas? Bradford said, pulling the horses to a stop. "I have your new school teacher, Miss Margaret Grace. This is Thomas Fletcher, head of the school board." Thomas Fletcher hurried down the steps, his expression shifting to one of relief. "Miss Grace, we were beginning to worry. The stage driver sent word that you were stranded on the road." "Welcome to Kingfisher." Bradford helped Margaret down from the wagon, and she felt the loss of his presence immediately, a cold space where his warmth had been. Thomas Fletcher was pumping her hand enthusiastically, talking a mile a minute about the school and the children and the room they had prepared for her above the general store. "Let me get your bag," Bradford said, retrieving her carpet bag from the wagon bed. He handed it to Thomas Fletcher, then turned to Margaret. "Good luck with your teaching, Miss Grace. I am sure you will do well." "Thank you again for your help," Margaret said, wanting to say more but not knowing how with Thomas Fletcher standing right there listening to every word. "I would not have made it without you. You would have found a way," Bradford said. "You are stronger than you think." He touched the brim of his hat in farewell, then climbed back onto the wagon and turned the horses back toward the main street. Margaret watched him go, feeling strangely bereft. Thomas Fletcher was still talking, leading her toward the school, but she barely heard him. She was thinking about the rancher's kindness, the way he had made her feel seen for the first time in her life. She told herself it was foolish to read too much into a simple act of charity, that she would probably never see him again, that she needed to focus on her new position and making a life for herself in Kingfisher. But that night, lying in the small room above the general store, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the town settling into sleep, Margaret found herself thinking about Bradford Davis and wondering if he was looking up at the same stars, carrying his loneliness like she carried hers. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Margaret threw herself into preparing for the school term, which would begin in October. She met the families of her students, learned the layout of the town, and began to establish herself in the community. The people of Kingfisher were welcoming, if a bit reserved, and she was careful to make a good impression. She thought about Bradford often, though she tried not to. She had come to Kingfisher to build a life for herself, not to pine after a man who had shown her a bit of kindness. But she could not forget the way he had looked at her, the way he had listened to her confession about feeling insignificant and responded with such certainty that she mattered. On a Saturday afternoon, Margaret was organizing books in the schoolroom when she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Bradford Davis standing on the steps, hat in hand, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Mr. Davis," she said, unable to keep the surprise and pleasure out of her voice. "What brings you to town?" "I had some business at the bank," Bradford said. "And I wanted to check on you, see how you were settling in." "That is very kind of you. Would you like to come in?" Bradford glanced past her into the schoolroom, then shook his head. "If you have some time, I thought you might like to take a walk. It is a nice day." Margaret grabbed her shawl and joined him outside. They walked down the main street, nodding to people who passed by. Margaret was aware of the curious looks they received, the way Mrs. Patterson from the general store watched them from her window, but she found she did not care. "The school looks ready," Bradford said as they turned onto a quieter side street. "Are you looking forward to teaching?" "I am," Margaret said, "and terrified at the same time. Thomas Fletcher says I will have 23 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old. It is a significant responsibility." "You will do well," Bradford said with quiet certainty. "You care about it, and that matters more than experience." They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, heading toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open prairie. The afternoon sun was warm but not oppressive, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of grass and late-blooming wildflowers. "I have been thinking about what you said," Bradford said suddenly. "About feeling insignificant in your family, about being overlooked. It has been bothering me." "Why?" Margaret asked, puzzled. Bradford stopped walking and turned to face her. "Because I know something about being invisible. After Caroline died, I disappeared into the ranch, into work, into grief. People stopped seeing me as Bradford Davis, a whole person. I became that poor widower, a figure of pity, defined entirely by my loss. It is a different kind of invisibility, but it is lonely all the same." Margaret felt her heart squeeze with sympathy. "I imagine people mean well, but they do not know what to say." "Exactly. So they say nothing of substance, or they avoid me entirely, or they look at me with pity in their eyes, and I want to shake them and say, 'I am still here. I still exist. I am more than just grief.'" Bradford's voice was passionate, almost angry, and then he stopped and took a breath. "I am sorry. I did not mean to unload on you like that." "Do not apologize," Margaret said softly. "I understand, and for what it is worth, I have never seen you as pitiable. From the moment you stopped to help me on that road, I saw you as capable and kind and strong enough to carry your grief without being crushed by it." Bradford looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "That is exactly it," he said. "You see me. Not the grief, not the widower, not the rancher people do business with. You see me, Bradford, the person underneath all of that. And I see you too, Margaret. I see someone brave and determined and far more significant than she believes herself to be." They stood there in the fading afternoon light, the town at their backs and the prairie stretching before them, seeing each other with a clarity that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Margaret felt something shift inside her, a recognition that this was important, that this man was important, that whatever was beginning between them mattered in a way nothing else in her life ever had. "I should get back," she said finally, though she did not want to. "Thomas Fletcher is very particular about propriety, and I do not want to give him reason to question my judgment." "Of course," Bradford said, though he looked as reluctant as she felt. They walked back toward the school in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was charged with things unsaid, with possibilities neither of them was quite ready to name. At the school steps, Bradford stopped and looked at her seriously. "May I call on you again? Properly, I mean, with whatever chaperones and conditions the town requires." "I would like that very much," Margaret said, her heart soaring. "Next Saturday, then. I will come to town and we can have dinner at the hotel." "Next Saturday," Margaret agreed, and the smile he gave her was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. She watched him walk back to where his wagon was hitched outside the general store, and Mrs. Patterson was definitely watching from the window now, but Margaret could not bring herself to care. Bradford Davis, the rancher who had saved her from the prairie and seen her as significant when she had spent her whole life feeling invisible, wanted to court her. The realization filled her with a joy so intense it frightened her. The week before their dinner seemed to crawl by. Margaret threw herself into final preparations for the school term, which would begin the Monday after her dinner with Bradford. She met with parents, organized lesson plans, and tried not to think constantly about Saturday evening. She was only partially successful. On Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Patterson cornered her in the general store while she was buying school supplies. "I hear Bradford Davis is courting you," the older woman said without preamble. Margaret felt her cheeks heat. "We are having dinner on Saturday, if that is what you mean." "Bradford is a good man, one of the best, but he is still grieving his wife, you know. Caroline was beloved by everyone in this town. She was beautiful and graceful and kind to everyone she met." Mrs. Patterson's expression was not unkind, but her words landed like stones. "It will be difficult for any woman to measure up to her memory." "I am not trying to replace her," Margaret said quietly. No one could do that. See that you remember it, Mrs. Patterson said, and moved on to discuss the price of pencils. Margaret left the store feeling unsettled. She had not thought about the fact that Bradford's late wife had been part of this community, that people would remember her and compare Margaret to her. She felt the old familiar fear creeping back in, the certainty that she was not special enough, not memorable enough, too ordinary to matter in the long run. But then Saturday came, and Bradford arrived at her door wearing a clean shirt and a nervous smile, and all her doubts evaporated. They walked to the hotel dining room together, aware of the curious eyes that followed them, and Bradford pulled out her chair like she was someone precious. Over roast chicken and potatoes, they talked about everything and nothing. Bradford told her about the ranch, about the challenges of breeding good cattle and managing men, and dealing with the unpredictable Oklahoma weather. Margaret told him about her lesson plans, about her hopes for her students, about the fear that she would not be good enough as a teacher. "You will be more than good enough," Bradford said firmly. "You care about those children and you prepared thoroughly. That is what matters." "How can you be so certain?" Margaret asked. "You barely know me." Bradford set down his fork and looked at her directly. "I know that you walked 12 miles in the heat because you were determined to honor a commitment. I know that you listen when people talk instead of just waiting for your turn to speak. I know that you see people, really see them, and that is a rare gift, Margaret. Those children are lucky to have you." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back. "You keep saying things like that, and I do not know how to respond. I am not used to being seen as anything but ordinary." "Then I will keep saying it until you believe it," Bradford said. "You are not ordinary, Margaret. You are extraordinary, and I am grateful every day that your stagecoach broke down on my land." They talked until the dining room began to empty, until the owner started giving them pointed looks. Bradford walked her back to her room above the general store, and at her door, he took her hand in his. "I know this is fast," he said. "I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but I feel like I can be honest with you in a way I have not been able to be with anyone since Caroline died. You do not treat me like I am broken or pitiable. You just treat me like a man, and that means more than I can say." "You do the same for me," Margaret said. "You make me feel seen, Bradford. You make me feel significant. I have never felt that way before." Bradford raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Then I will make it my mission to ensure you feel significant every day for as long as you will let me." Margaret's breath caught at the promise in his words. "That is a bold mission." "I am a determined man when I set my mind to something," Bradford said, his eyes warm. "Good night, Margaret. I will see you after church on Sunday." "I will look forward to it," Margaret said. She watched him walk away, then went inside and leaned against the door, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was beating like a wild thing. She was falling in love with Bradford Davis, and it was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. The school term began on Monday, and Margaret discovered that teaching was simultaneously the most challenging and most rewarding thing she had ever done. The children ranged from eager to resistant, from studious to distracted, and managing them all required every bit of creativity and patience she possessed. But when she saw understanding dawn in a child's eyes, when a struggling reader finally decoded a difficult word, when the older students engaged in thoughtful discussion about a text, she felt a satisfaction deeper than anything she had experienced in her life. Bradford came to town every Saturday, and they established a routine. He would arrive in the afternoon, they would have dinner at the hotel, and then they would walk through the town or sit on the school steps and talk until the stars came out. He told her about his childhood in Texas, about the brother who had died in a riding accident when Bradford was 12, about his parents who had wanted him to be a lawyer, but supported him when he chose ranching instead. She told him about growing up invisible, about the ways she had learned to make herself useful so people would not resent her presence, about the secret dream she had harbored of writing a book someday. "What would you write about?" Bradford asked, genuinely interested. "I do not know," Margaret admitted. "Maybe about people who feel invisible, who think they do not matter, and how they find their place in the world." "You should write it," Bradford said. "You have a way with words, and that story matters," Margaret laughed. "When would I find the time?" "Teaching takes every hour of every day." "Then write during the summer when school is not in session," Bradford said. "Or write a little bit each Sunday after church. If it matters to you, you will find the time." She realized he was right, and she began carrying a small notebook with her, jotting down observations and ideas whenever they occurred to her. It felt self-indulgent at first, but Bradford's encouragement gave her permission to pursue something that was entirely her own. As October turned to November, their courtship deepened. Bradford introduced her to his ranch hands, and she saw the respect they had for him, the way he treated them fairly and listened to their concerns. Mrs. Chen approved of her, which Bradford said was the highest endorsement possible. Margaret met some of Bradford's neighbors, ranchers and farmers who spoke highly of his character and business acumen. But she also became aware of the shadow that hung over their relationship: Caroline. People mentioned her often, always kindly but with a wistfulness that made Margaret feel like she was competing with a ghost. Caroline had been beautiful. Caroline had been gracious. Caroline had made the best apple pie in the territory. Caroline had been perfect, and Margaret was just ordinary Margaret, the overlooked seventh daughter who was lucky to have caught Bradford's attention at all. She tried not to let it bother her, but the comparisons accumulated like small cuts. Then one Sunday after church, as she and Bradford were preparing to take their weekly walk, an older woman stopped them. Mrs. Henrietta Walton was a pillar of the community, wealthy and imperious, and she looked Margaret up and down with obvious assessment. "So you are the new schoolteacher Bradford has been courting," she said. "You are quite different from Caroline." "Yes, madam," Margaret said, unsure how else to respond. Caroline was so refined, so elegant. She came from a good family back east. "What did you say your background was, dear?" "I am from Kansas City," Margaret said, feeling her cheeks burn. "My father is a clerk." "I see." Mrs. Walton's tone made it clear that Margaret's background was found wanting. "Well, I suppose Bradford knows his own mind. Caroline will be a hard act to follow, but I am sure you will do your best." She sailed away, leaving Margaret feeling small and insignificant. All the old wounds reopened. Bradford's jaw was tight with anger. "Mrs. Walton had no right to speak to you that way." "She was just stating facts," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Your wife was special and I am ordinary. Everyone knows it." "That is not true," Bradford said fiercely. He took her hand and led her away from the churchyard, toward the edge of town where they could have some privacy. When they were alone, he turned to face her, his hands on her shoulders. "Margaret, listen to me. Caroline was my wife and I loved her, and I will always carry her memory with me. But she is gone, and I am still here, still living. You are not ordinary. You are brilliant and brave, and you make me want to be more than just a man going through the motions of living." "Do you understand what I am saying?" "I am trying to," Margaret whispered. "But people keep comparing me to her, and I know I cannot measure up. She was everything I am not." "You are right about that," Bradford said, and Margaret flinched until he continued. "Caroline was gentle and quiet. She preferred the safety of home to adventure. She never challenged me or pushed me to be better. I loved her for who she was, but Margaret, you are different. You are fierce and determined. You walked 12 miles in the heat because you refused to give up. You left everything you knew to build a new life. You stand up for yourself and your students. You make me think and feel and hope again after 3 years of just existing." He cupped her face in his calloused hands, his brown eyes intense. "You are not Caroline, and I am not asking you to be. I am asking you to be yourself, to let me court you, to give this thing between us a chance to grow. Because I am falling in love with you, Margaret Grace, and it has nothing to do with replacing anyone. It has everything to do with who you are." Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I am falling in love with you too," she admitted. "But I am afraid. I am afraid of not being enough, of being overlooked again, of being forgotten. Then I will spend every day proving to you that you are more than enough," Bradford said. "Making you feel significant will be my mission, Margaret, for as long as you will let me." He kissed her then, soft and careful, and Margaret felt something inside her uncurl and bloom. She kissed him back, tasting salt from her own tears and the sweetness of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Bradford wiped her tears away with his thumbs and smiled at her with such tenderness that she felt her heart might burst. "Come to the ranch for Thanksgiving," he said. "Spend the day with me and Mrs. Chen and the men. Let me show you what your life could be like if you choose me." "I would love that," Margaret said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Thanksgiving arrived cold and clear, the prairie grass brown and the sky a sharp, brilliant blue. Bradford picked Margaret up in his wagon before dawn, bundled in a thick coat Mrs. Chen had sent for her. They drove through the quiet morning, watching the sun rise over the endless Oklahoma landscape, and Margaret felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before. The ranch house was warm and fragrant with the smell of roasting turkey. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself, preparing a feast that would feed the entire ranch. The men ate in shifts, coming in from their work to fill their plates and offer shy greetings to Margaret before returning to their duties. Bradford's foreman, a taciturn man named Jack Sullivan, told her seriously that she was welcome at the ranch anytime, which Bradford later explained was the highest praise Jack ever gave anyone. After dinner, Bradford took her on a tour of the ranch. He showed her the cattle, explaining his breeding program and his hopes for expanding the herd. He showed her the horses, including the roan mare that had carried her to safety that first day. He showed her the fields where they grew hay, the bunkhouse where the men lived, the workshop where they repaired equipment. Finally, he brought her to a small rise that overlooked the entire property. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Bradford stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. "This is what I am offering you," he said quietly. "A life here with me, building something together. It will not always be easy. Ranching is hard work, and the weather is unpredictable, and there will be lean years. But it will be ours, Margaret. We will build it together, and I swear to you that you will never feel invisible or insignificant again. You will be my partner in all things, my equal, the person I turn to with my hopes and my fears." Margaret turned in his arms, looking up at him. The setting sun gilded his features, and she thought he had never looked more handsome or more serious. "Are you asking me to marry you, Bradford Davis?" "I am," he said. "I know we have only known each other for 2 months, and people will say it is too soon, that I am still in mourning, that you should wait. But I am 30 years old and I know my own mind. I love you, Margaret. I want to spend my life proving to you every single day that you are the most significant person in my world. Will you marry me?" Margaret thought about her life in Kansas City, where she had been invisible. She thought about the risk of saying yes to a man she had known for such a short time. She thought about all the sensible, cautious reasons she should wait, should be careful, should protect her heart. And then she thought about the way Bradford saw her, really saw her, and made her feel like she mattered for the first time in her life. She thought about the joy she felt when she was with him, the sense of coming home to a place she had never been. She thought about the life they could build together, full of purpose and partnership and love. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I will marry you." Bradford let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the prairie and kissed her until she was breathless and laughing. When he finally set her down, he pulled a ring from his pocket. It was simple, a gold band with a small sapphire. "This was my grandmother's," he said. "Caroline wore my mother's ring, but I thought you might like to have something different, something that is just yours." The thoughtfulness of it, the recognition that she was not a replacement but her own person, brought fresh tears to Margaret's eyes. "It is perfect," she said, and it was. He slipped it onto her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her. They stayed on the rise until the stars came out, making plans and dreaming together. They decided to marry in the spring, after the school term ended. Margaret would move to the ranch, and they would hire someone to teach her students the following year. She felt a pang at the thought of leaving the school, but Bradford assured her she could continue teaching if she wished, perhaps starting a small school on the ranch for the children of his workers and neighbors. When he finally drove her back to Kingfisher, it was late and they were both giddy with happiness and plans. At her door, he kissed her one more time and said, "Sleep well, my future wife. I will see you on Saturday." "Saturday seems a long way away," Margaret said. "Then I will come to town on Tuesday as well," Bradford said. "And Thursday. I will come every day if you want me to." "Every day sounds perfect," Margaret said, and the smile he gave her was brighter than the stars. The next few months passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Margaret continued teaching, and Bradford came to town 3 times a week to court her properly. They attended church together, had dinner at the hotel, and spent hours talking about their future. Margaret met more of Bradford's friends and neighbors, and she slowly began to feel accepted as his intended rather than compared to Caroline. There was one awkward moment when Bradford took her to visit Caroline's grave in the small cemetery behind the church. Margaret had not known what to expect, but Bradford had been matter-of-fact about it. "I want you to know that I will always love Caroline," he said as they stood before the simple headstone. "She was part of my life, and I will not pretend she did not exist. But I also want you to know that my love for you does not diminish what I felt for her. People can love more than once, Margaret, and my love for you is complete and whole and not a shadow of anything else." Margaret had squeezed his hand, grateful for his honesty. "I would never ask you to forget her," she said. "She was part of making you the man you are, and I am grateful to her for that." After that conversation, the ghost of Caroline seemed to fade. Margaret stopped worrying about comparisons and started focusing on building her own relationship with Bradford, one based on who they were now rather than who anyone had been before. In March, Margaret's mother sent a curt letter acknowledging the news of her engagement. It was not warm or enthusiastic, but it was more attention than Margaret had ever received from her family. She wrote back with details of the wedding and an invitation, though she did not expect anyone to make the long journey to Oklahoma Territory. To her surprise, in April, her eldest sister Marion arrived in Kingfisher. She was 31 now, married to a banker and pregnant with her 3rd child. She explained that she had insisted on coming because she wanted to see Margaret settled and happy. "I know Mother and Father were not good to you," Marion said bluntly over tea in Margaret's small room. "I was old enough to notice, even if I did not do anything about it. You deserved better than to be overlooked and undervalued. I am glad you found someone who sees you for who you are." It was more acknowledgement than Margaret had ever received, and she found herself tearing up. "Thank you for coming," she said. "It means more than you know." Marion stayed for a week, and Margaret introduced her to Bradford. Her sister approved wholeheartedly, declaring him a good man who clearly adored his intended. Bradford, for his part, was polite and welcoming, but Margaret could see the fierce protectiveness in his eyes. He was watching to make sure Marion treated Margaret with the respect she deserved. "Your sister seems nice," Bradford said after Marion had left to return to Kansas City. "But I am glad you do not need her approval. You are marrying me because you want to, not because your family finally decided to pay attention." "I am marrying you because I love you," Margaret said firmly. "Because you make me feel like the most important person in the world, because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Bradford pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "Good. Because you are the most important person in my world, and I am counting down the days until you are my wife." The wedding took place on a brilliant May morning in the Kingfisher Church. Margaret wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her make, with wildflowers from the prairie in her hair. Marion had stayed for the ceremony, standing as Margaret's matron of honor. Jack Sullivan stood up for Bradford, looking uncomfortable in his best clothes but fiercely proud to be included. The church was full of people from the town and surrounding ranches, everyone wanting to witness Bradford Davis's new beginning. Thomas Fletcher read from the Song of Solomon about love being strong as death. Mrs. Chen wept openly. Even Mrs. Walton, who had been so critical before, nodded approvingly as Margaret and Bradford exchanged their vows. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Bradford kissed Margaret with such tenderness that several women in the congregation sighed audibly. Margaret felt like her heart might burst from happiness. She was married to Bradford Davis, the man who had made it his mission to prove she was significant, and she knew without a doubt that she had finally found where she belonged. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up outside and enough food to feed the entire county. Mrs. Chen had been cooking for days, and Bradford had hired a trio of musicians from Oklahoma City. People danced and ate and drank, celebrating the union with genuine joy. Margaret danced with Bradford, with Jack Sullivan, with Thomas Fletcher, with men she had never met who wanted to congratulate the new Mrs. Davis. As the sun began to set, Bradford swept her away from the party and led her to the house. He carried her over the threshold of their bedroom, a space he had completely refurnished for her. Everything that had belonged to Caroline was gone, replaced with new curtains, a new quilt, new furniture. The message was clear. This was their beginning, unencumbered by the past. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, looking around at the thoughtfulness of it. "I want you to feel at home here," Bradford said. "I want you to know that this is your house, your ranch, your life now. You are not stepping into someone else's place. You are creating something new with me." Margaret turned to him, taking his face in her hands. "You have kept your promise," she said. "You have made me feel significant every single day since we met. I love you, Bradford Davis, with everything I am." "And I love you, Margaret Davis," he said, kissing her deeply. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never forget how much you matter." They made love that night with the windows open, the prairie wind carrying the scent of grass and possibility. Margaret had never felt more seen, more cherished, more significant than she did in her husband's arms. The girl who had been overlooked and undervalued was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth, because her husband reflected it back to her every day. The next months settled into a rhythm of work and partnership. Margaret learned the rhythms of ranch life, helping Mrs. Chen with the household management, learning to ride properly, even assisting with some of the ranch bookkeeping when Bradford discovered she had a head for numbers. She also started teaching again, just a few hours a week, for the children of ranch workers and nearby farms who had no easy access to the Kingfisher school. She held classes in the ranch's large parlor, and Bradford built her a small library room where she could store books and materials. In August, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. Bradford was overjoyed, immediately becoming protective and hovering. Margaret, who had never been fussed over in her life, found it alternately annoying and endearing. "I am not made of glass," she protested when he insisted she should not help with the canning. "You are carrying our child," Bradford said firmly. "Let Mrs. Chen and me handle the heavy work. You can direct us if you want to feel useful." But he said it with such love that Margaret could not truly be angry. She settled into her pregnancy with the same determination she brought to everything else, reading medical books and preparing the nursery with Bradford's enthusiastic help. Their son was born in April of 1893, arriving during a spring thunderstorm that Bradford claimed was appropriate for a child with such a strong will. They named him William Bradford Davis, and he had his father's brown eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. Bradford wept when he held his son for the first time, and Margaret knew he was thinking of Caroline and the children they had never been able to have. "She would be happy for you," Margaret said softly. "For us." "I know," Bradford said. "And I am grateful every day that I get to have this with you." William was a healthy, happy baby who seemed to delight in the attention of everyone on the ranch. The cowboys took turns bouncing him and making silly faces, and Mrs. Chen doted on him shamelessly. Margaret discovered that motherhood came naturally to her, perhaps because she had spent so long being overlooked herself. She was determined that her son would always know he was loved and valued. When William was 6 months old, Bradford came to Margaret with a proposal. "I have been thinking about what you said about wanting to write a book. I want you to do it." "When would I have time?" Margaret asked, though the idea tempted her. "William naps twice a day. Mrs. Chen and I can watch him. Take those hours for yourself to write. It is important, Margaret. You have a story to tell about people who feel invisible and how they find their significance. The world needs that story." So Margaret began writing, an hour here and there, slowly building a novel about a young woman who felt overlooked by her family and found her purpose teaching in a frontier town. It was fiction, but it drew heavily on her own experiences. Bradford read each chapter as she completed it, offering encouragement and thoughtful feedback. "This is good," he said seriously after reading one particularly difficult chapter about the heroine's loneliness. "People need to read this, Margaret. You have a gift." 2 years passed in contentment and growth. William grew into a bright, active toddler who loved the ranch and the animals and following his father around. Margaret finished her book, and with Bradford's encouragement, sent it to a publisher in New York. To her shock, they accepted it, offering to publish it the following year. When the letter arrived, Bradford picked her up and spun her around, whooping with joy. "I knew it," he said. "I knew you had something important to say." In 1895, Margaret's book was published under the title The Invisible Girl. It did not become a bestseller, but it sold respectably and received positive reviews. Several reviewers commented on the authenticity of the heroine's emotions and the hopeful message about finding one's place in the world. Margaret received letters from readers, mostly women, thanking her for writing a story that resonated with their own experiences of feeling overlooked. Bradford was impossibly proud, showing the book to everyone who came to the ranch and keeping a stack of them in the parlor to give as gifts. He framed the first positive review and hung it in Margaret's writing room. "See," he said, pulling her close. "You are significant, Margaret. You always were, but now the whole world knows it too." That same year, Margaret became pregnant again. Their daughter, Catherine Caroline Davis, was born in February of 1896. Bradford chose the middle name to honor his first wife, and Margaret was touched by the gesture. It felt right to acknowledge Caroline as part of their family story, a link in the chain that had led them to each other. Catherine was a calm, observant baby, so different from her boisterous brother that Margaret and Bradford often marveled at how two children from the same parents could be so distinct. William adored his baby sister, constantly trying to help take care of her, though his help was sometimes more hindrance than assistance. The ranch continued to prosper. Bradford's careful breeding program produced excellent cattle, and his reputation for fair dealing made him a trusted figure in the territory. When Oklahoma achieved statehood in 1907, Bradford was approached about running for the territorial legislature, but he declined. He had no interest in politics, he said. His mission was here, running the ranch and making sure his wife and children knew they were the center of his world. Margaret continued teaching her small school and writing. She published 2 more books over the next decade, both modest successes. But more than the writing or the teaching, she found her greatest satisfaction in her family and in the life she and Bradford had built together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Bradford took her back to the rise where he had proposed. It was May again, the prairie ablaze with wildflowers, the sky impossibly blue. William, now 9 years old, and Catherine, now 7, ran ahead, shouting at the clouds and chasing grasshoppers. "You remember what I promised you here?" Bradford asked, his arm around her waist. "You promised to make me feel significant every day," Margaret said. "And you have kept that promise, Bradford. Every single day you have made me feel seen and valued and loved." "Good," Bradford said, kissing her temple, "because you are all of those things and more. You are my partner, my love, the person who brought me back to life after I thought I was done living. You are the mother of my children and the author of books that touch people's hearts. You are a teacher who shapes young minds and a woman of courage and strength. You are everything, Margaret. Never forget that." Margaret leaned into him, watching their children play against the backdrop of the endless prairie. She thought about the girl she had been, the youngest of 7 daughters who had believed she was forgettable and insignificant. She thought about the woman she had become, a rancher's wife, a mother, a writer, a teacher, someone who mattered. "I used to think I was invisible," she said softly. "I used to think my presence or absence made no difference to anyone. And now," Bradford asked, "now I know that I matter. To you, to our children, to my students, to the readers who write me letters. But most importantly, I matter to myself. I finally see my own worth, and that is the greatest gift you have given me, Bradford. You saw me first, and you taught me to see myself." Bradford turned her in his arms, looking at her with the same intensity he had shown that first day when he found her walking alone on the road. "You are magnificent, Margaret Davis, and I am the luckiest man alive to call you my wife." They stood there until the sun began to set, painting the sky in glorious colors, while their children played and laughed around them. It was not a dramatic moment, not the climax of some grand adventure. It was simply life, the everyday magic of being known and loved and valued. And for Margaret, who had spent her whole youth feeling invisible, it was everything. Years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of ranch life. William grew into a thoughtful young man who shared his father's love of ranching and his mother's intellectual curiosity. He attended the Territorial University in Norman and returned to help run the Double D Ranch, bringing new ideas and energy to the operation. Catherine inherited her mother's gift for words and her father's determination. She became a teacher like her mother, eventually taking over Margaret's small school and expanding it to serve more children in the area. In 1908, Margaret published her most successful book, a sweeping story about the Oklahoma land run and the people who had gambled everything for a chance at a new life. It drew on her own experience of leaving everything behind to start fresh, and it resonated with readers across the country. The book earned enough money that Bradford was able to expand the ranch significantly, purchasing adjoining land from a retiring neighbor. "We should save this money," Margaret protested. "It is from my writing. You should not have to invest it in the ranch." "Margaret," Bradford said patiently, taking her hands in his, "we are partners. What is yours is mine, and what is mine is yours. This ranch is as much yours as it is mine. You have worked just as hard to make it successful, managing the household, teaching, supporting me in every decision. Your money is our money, and if you want to invest it in our future, then that is what we will do." She kissed him then, grateful once again for a husband who saw her as an equal partner rather than a dependent or an accessory. They used the money to buy the land and build a new bunkhouse for their growing crew of ranch hands. Bradford also built Margaret a separate writing cabin, a small structure near the main house with windows on all sides that let in the prairie light. It became her sanctuary, the place where she crafted stories and felt most fully herself. Mrs. Chen passed away in 1910, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 72. Her death hit both Margaret and Bradford hard. She had been more than a housekeeper. She had been family, the steady presence who had held them together through grief and joy. They buried her in the Kingfisher Cemetery with a headstone that read, "Beloved friend and second mother," in both English and Chinese characters that Bradford had painstakingly commissioned from an artisan in Oklahoma City. After Mrs. Chen's death, Margaret took over more of the household management herself, with help from a young woman named Sarah who lived on a neighboring farm. Sarah was quiet and hardworking, and Margaret trained her in Mrs. Chen's methods, feeling like she was passing on a legacy. In 1914, when war broke out in Europe, William was 21 and Catherine was 18. There was fear that America would be drawn into the conflict, but for the moment, life on the ranch continued as it always had. William had begun courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a spirited young woman named Elizabeth who could ride and rope as well as any man. Catherine was teaching at the school full-time now, having taken over completely when Margaret decided to focus on her writing. Bradford was 53 years old, his hair graying at the temples, but he was still strong and vital. He and Margaret had settled into the comfortable intimacy of a long marriage, the kind where they could communicate with a glance, where they knew each other's thoughts before they were spoken. One evening, sitting on the porch and watching the sunset, Margaret said, "Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if that stagecoach had not broken down?" Bradford considered the question. "Sometimes, but mostly I am just grateful it did. I was existing before I met you, Margaret, going through the motions, working myself into the ground to avoid feeling anything. You gave me a reason to live again, not just survive." "You did the same for me," Margaret said. "I was so certain I did not matter, that I was just taking up space in the world. You showed me that I was wrong. You made feeling significant your mission, and you succeeded, Bradford. You changed my entire life." "We changed each other's lives," Bradford corrected gently. "That is what love does when it is real. It transforms both people." They sat in companionable silence, holding hands, watching the colors fade from the sky. After 20 years of marriage, Margaret still felt a thrill when Bradford touched her, still caught herself watching him work and marveling that this good, strong man was her husband. The passion had evolved into something deeper and more enduring, a love that was woven into every aspect of their lives. William married Elizabeth in 1916, a joyful ceremony that brought both families together. They built a house on the Double D Ranch, and William officially became Bradford's partner in running the operation. Margaret watched her son with his new bride and saw echoes of herself and Bradford in their early days. The excitement, the promise, the determination to build something lasting together. When America entered the war in 1917, there was fear that William would be drafted, but his work on the ranch was deemed essential to food production, and he was spared. Still, many young men from Kingfisher and the surrounding areas went off to fight, and Margaret organized her students to write letters to the soldiers, to let them know they were remembered and valued. It was a small thing, but it mattered, and Margaret had learned long ago that small things that made people feel significant were never truly small. Catherine, now 21, had attracted the attention of the new doctor in Kingfisher, a young man named James Harrison who had moved from Philadelphia to practice frontier medicine. He was bookish and thoughtful, and Catherine loved him for his dedication to helping people. They married in 1918, just as the war was ending, and Catherine continued teaching while James built his practice. Bradford was overjoyed to see both his children settled and happy. He told Margaret often that his greatest pride was not the success of the ranch, but the good, capable, compassionate people their children had become. "We did well," he would say, pulling her close. "Despite neither of us having perfect examples from our own parents, we raised children who know they matter and who make others feel like they matter too. That is our real legacy, Margaret." In 1920, Margaret's youngest sister wrote to inform her that their mother had passed away. Margaret felt surprisingly little at the news. She had made peace long ago with her family's neglect, and the woman who had given birth to her had never really been a mother in any meaningful sense. She wrote a polite condolence letter and sent flowers, but she did not make the journey back to Kansas City. Her real life, her real family, was here in Oklahoma, on the ranch, with Bradford and their children, and the life they had built from nothing. The 1920s brought prosperity to the ranch. The post-war economy was booming, and beef prices were high. Bradford and William expanded their operation, implementing new techniques and technologies. They were among the first ranchers in the area to get electricity, and Bradford surprised Margaret with electric lights in her writing cabin. "Now you can write at night if the mood strikes," he said, grinning at her delight. "As if I needed another reason to spend time in there," Margaret teased, but she was touched by his thoughtfulness. Even after 25 years of marriage, Bradford was still finding ways to make her feel valued and supported. In 1923, Elizabeth gave birth to Margaret and Bradford's first grandchild, a boy they named Bradford William Davis. Bradford was beside himself with joy, doting on his grandson with shameless favoritism. Margaret watched her husband cradle the baby and felt her heart overflow with love. This man, who had found her lost on a prairie road and made it his mission to prove she was significant, was now a grandfather, still strong and vital and kind. Catherine and James followed with a daughter in 1924, Rose Margaret Harrison. Now Margaret had 2 grandchildren, and she discovered that being a grandmother was even more wonderful than being a mother. She could spoil them and love them, and then hand them back to their parents when they grew fussy. She told them stories and taught them to read and watch them grow with the same wonder she had felt watching her own children. The Depression hit Oklahoma hard in the 1930s, compounded by the devastating drought that turned the prairie into the Dust Bowl. The Double D Ranch suffered along with everyone else. Cattle died from lack of water and feed, crops failed, Dust storms buried equipment and seeped into every crack of every building. It was the hardest time the ranch had faced since Bradford founded it. But Bradford and Margaret faced it together, making hard decisions about culling the herd, diversifying their income by taking in boarders and selling eggs and butter, helping neighbors when they could and accepting help when they needed it. William and Elizabeth stood with them, working tirelessly to keep the ranch afloat. Catherine and James provided what assistance they could from town, and James treated ranch families for reduced rates or barter payment. Through it all, Bradford and Margaret supported each other. On the worst days, when the dust was so thick they could barely breathe and the future looked impossibly bleak, they would sit together in the evening and remind each other of their blessings. 2 healthy children, 2 wonderful grandchildren, a marriage that had weathered every storm, a deep well of love that sustained them through the hardest times. "We will make it through this," Bradford would say, his arm around Margaret's shoulders. "We have survived worse. We have each other, and that is enough." And it was. The ranch survived the Depression and the Dust Bowl through sheer determination and the strength of the Davis family. By the late 1930s, the rains returned, and slowly, painfully, the land began to recover. In 1941, when Margaret was 71 and Bradford was 79, their grandson Bradford William enlisted in the military following the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was a difficult time, watching a beloved grandchild go off to war, but Margaret wrote him letters every week, filling them with news from home and encouragement. She told him he mattered, that his service was significant, that he was loved and valued and awaited eagerly at home. She never forgot the power of feeling seen and significant, and she was determined that her grandson would know it even across the miles and danger of war. Bradford William came home safely in 1945, decorated for valor and ready to resume his life on the ranch. By then, William was 52 and beginning to think about retirement, ready to turn the ranch over to the next generation. Bradford, now 83, had officially retired from active management years before, but he still rose every morning to check on the cattle and offer advice when asked. Margaret, at 75, had published her last book in 1943, a memoir of her life on the ranch and her marriage to Bradford. It was called The Rancher's Mission, and it told the story of how an overlooked girl and a grieving widower had found each other and built a life of purpose and love. The book was successful beyond anything she had written before, resonating with readers who were weary of war and death and desperate for a story about enduring love and hope. She dedicated it to Bradford, who made me feel significant when I believed I was invisible. "You completed your mission, my love. I have never doubted my worth since the day you found me on that dusty road." When Bradford read the dedication, he wept. "I was the lucky one," he told her. "You saved me just as much as I saved you. We saved each other, Margaret." They sat together on the porch in the evening as they had done for decades, watching the Oklahoma sunset paint the sky in familiar colors. They were old now, their bodies worn by years of work and life, but their love was as strong as ever. Bradford still held her hand, still looked at her like she was the most remarkable woman in the world, still made her feel significant with every word and gesture. "You remember what I said to you the day I proposed?" Bradford asked. "You said you wanted to spend your life proving to me that I was significant," Margaret said. "You said it would be your mission. And did I succeed?" Margaret turned to look at him, this man who had been her partner and lover and best friend for over 50 years. "You succeeded beyond measure," she said softly. "You changed my entire understanding of myself. You taught me that I mattered, not because of anything I did, but simply because I existed. That was the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, Bradford." You saw me when I was invisible, and you never stopped seeing me. You were never invisible to me, Bradford said. From that first moment, walking alone on that road with such determination and courage, I saw you, Margaret, the real you, and I fell in love with what I saw. They kissed as the sun dipped below the horizon. Two old people who had loved each other through joy and sorrow, prosperity and hardship, through children and grandchildren, and the slow passage of years. They had built a life of significance together, not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through the steady accumulation of days spent truly seeing and valuing each other. Bradford passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1948, at the age of 86. Margaret held his hand as his breathing slowed and finally stopped, and though her heart broke, she was grateful he had gone gently, without pain or fear. She had loved him for 53 years, and he had loved her right back, completely and without reservation. At his funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives Bradford had touched, ranchers he had helped during hard times, children Margaret had taught who had grown into adults, neighbors and friends and family. But Margaret barely noticed the crowd. She stood by his casket, thinking about the young rancher who had stopped to help a stranded stranger, who had made it his mission to prove she was significant, who had kept that promise every day of their marriage. She lived for 5 more years after Bradford died, long enough to see more grandchildren born and to finish one final book, a collection of letters she and Bradford had written to each other over the years. She died in her sleep in 1953 at the age of 83, in the bed she had shared with Bradford, in the house they had made into a home. They buried her next to Bradford in the Kingfisher Cemetery, under a shared headstone that read, Bradford Davis, 1862, 1948, Margaret Grace Davis, 1868, 1953. He made her significant, she made him whole together. They built a life of love. The Double D Ranch continued under the management of William, then Bradford William, then the great-grandchildren who came after. But more than the land or the cattle or the buildings, the real legacy of Bradford and Margaret Davis was the understanding they passed down through generations. That every person has inherent worth, that feeling seen and valued is essential to the human spirit, and that love, real love, is about making each other's significance visible every single day. Years after both had passed, a reporter came to interview the family about Margaret's books, which had experienced a revival of popularity. Rose Margaret Harrison, now an elderly woman herself, spoke about her grandmother with reverence. She used to tell me that she had spent her whole youth feeling invisible, Rose said. She said her family never really saw her, never understood her worth. But then she met my grandfather, and he made it his mission to prove to her that she mattered. And he did. He spent every day of their marriage showing her that she was significant. But you know what? She did the same for him. He had been lost in grief, just going through the motions of living. She brought him back to life, gave him purpose again. They saved each other, and they built something beautiful together. That is what real love looks like. The story of the rancher who made significance his mission became part of the family lore, told and retold to each new generation. It was a reminder that the greatest gift you can give another person is to truly see them, to recognize their worth, to make them feel significant in a world that too often overlooks and undervalues. Margaret Grace had whispered that she would never feel significant, that she was just an overlooked girl from a large family, forgettable and ordinary. But Bradford Davis had heard that whisper, and he had made proving her wrong his life's work. And in doing so, he had given her not just love, but the foundation of self-worth that allowed her to become everything she was capable of being. A teacher, a mother, a writer, a partner, a woman who mattered. And she, in turn, had given him something just as precious: the ability to love again, to hope again, to see a future beyond grief. She had made him whole when he had been broken, had filled his life with purpose and joy and children and laughter. Together, they had built a legacy that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Double D Ranch. They had shown their children and grandchildren what it meant to truly value another person, to see them fully and love them completely. They had demonstrated that significance comes not from grand achievements or recognition, but from being known and valued by the people who matter most. Their story, the story of the overlooked girl and the grieving rancher who found each other on a dusty Oklahoma road and built a life of meaning together, became the kind of love story that transcends time. Not because it was dramatic or tragic or filled with grand gestures, but because it was real. Because it was about two people who saw each other's worth when the world had dismissed them, and who spent their lives reflecting that worth back to each other. That is what Bradford meant when he said making Margaret feel significant would be his mission. And that is what Margaret meant when she finally understood her own worth. Together, they created something that mattered profoundly. A love that was built on the bedrock of mutual respect and recognition, a partnership of equals who lifted each other up, a family that understood the importance of making every person feel valued. The last entry in Margaret's journal, written shortly before she died, reads simply, "I have lived a significant life, not because of my books or my teaching, though those mattered, but because I was loved completely by a good man who saw me when I believed myself invisible. And because I loved him in return with everything I had. That is enough. That is everything." And it was.